Bring it on!
Of course I'm fit. All systems go.
Say.
Emergency. User death imminent.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the MS-DOS project. Today I will be talking about a game I enjoy immensely, the original Half-Life. The 1990s saw not only the birth of the first-person shooter genre, but also saw it explode in popularity and quickly enter the popular consciousness. Although there were a few earlier titles that took place from a first-person perspective, they were largely slow-paced dungeon crawlers that were locked to the four cardinal directions. The technology for a free movement, texture-mapped game did not exist on home gaming systems until the early 1990s, and as soon as Doom hit shelves, it became an instant fixture on PCs and any platform it could possibly be ported to. And with the smash success of Doom, every company and freelancer saw an opportunity to make their own Doom clones, and thus the first-person shooter was born. Further improvements in technology and gameplay were made over the next several years. System Shock introduced the ability to free look in any direction in addition to free movement, and Quake 2 years later added fully 3D modeled and textured enemies. And while the technology was improving, other developers were playing with the type of setting that could be used in a first-person shooter, with anything from fantasy to military, and even Star Wars being used to decorate these worlds with different weapons and flavor. However, as the 1990s progressed, a new player entered the space that would redefine what a first-person shooter could be forever. Two of the developers who helped contribute to this FPS boom were Gabe Newell and Mike Harrington. They both worked at Microsoft in the mid-90s and helped develop the Windows 95 port of the original Doom. In late 1995, it was estimated that Doom was installed on more PCs than Windows 95, and this figure inspired Newell. In an interview with Bloomberg in 2012, he said this, quote, "To me, that was a lightning bolt. Microsoft was hiring 500 people sales teams, and this entire company was 12 people. Yet it had created the most widely distributed software in the world. There was a sea change coming." Around the same time that Gabe Newell was contemplating video game development, Harrington was tiring of the massive growth at Microsoft. Here's what he said about his decision to leave and start out on his own.
And then I was having lunch with Gabe, and I said, "Gabe, I'm leaving. I'm just going to leave, and I'm going to start a game company." He goes, "I want to leave. I want to start a game company." I'm like, all right, and that was it.
A lot of this story comes from a documentary done for the 25th anniversary of Half-Life, including that statement from Mike Harrington, and I will leave a link in the description if you want to watch that in its entirety. One of the first people that Harrington told about his desire to start a game company was Michael Abrash, a friend from Microsoft who had taken a job at id Software a few months prior to Gabe and Mike deciding to leave. Abrash told them enthusiastically that they should use the Quake engine in order to build their first project. So they flew down to Texas to meet with Abrash, John Romero, and the id team in order to see if they could get some advice on starting a game company and make some sort of deal to use the engine. Romero gave them lots of advice on how to build a game developer, and while they didn't fully iron out a licensing deal for the engine, because they were friends with Abrash, they were given the entire source code to Quake on CD. This is probably something that would never happen today, but it allowed Newell and Harrington to come back to Seattle and found Valve Software on August 25th, 1996. After founding the company and finding an engine, the first thing that Valve had to do was get together a team to start building their first game. Level designer Dave Riller had this to say about the kind of people that Valve hired.
I think most of us had no game development experience. We were either amateurs working in our homes at night for fun, or some people were from the software world, but they had never worked on a game. I think we had 3 or 4 people in the entire company who had actually shipped a game when we started Half-Life.
Although only a few people on the team had professional game development experience, Valve did tap into a scene that had sprung up around the id shooters over the last few years: modders. A lot of the early hires for artists and level designers came from people that were well known for creating excellent mods in the Doom and Quake communities, and their creative experience helped inject a ton of life into the company and project as a whole. Even in 1996, the games industry was still very young, and many people were switching careers to join it, with Valve being no exception to this.
Like, the person who wrote more code on Half-Life was a chemistry major who decided to be an IP lawyer in Atlanta, right? And he ended up writing more code than anybody else. The creature designer for most of the AI for the creatures in the game was a manager at a Waffle House. It's not like there are a bunch of people that you could say, oh, this person, you know, has a PhD in video game design. It was that combination of both finding those people when it wasn't necessarily easy to find them at that stage in the video game industry, and then also convincing them that it was a better place to work than anybody else.
In the early days of Valve, there were actually 2 projects being worked on due to ship soon after one another. The first was called Quiver, which would eventually become Half-Life, and the second was called Prospero. Not much is known about Prospero, but from the little we do know, the game would have focused heavily on exploration and would have featured a player with some sort of psionic powers, not totally unlike those featured later in System Shock 2. However, as Quiver continued to get further along in development, it started to not only steal Prospero's technology, but also its manpower, eventually ending the project. As for Quiver, the codename was an allusion to the Arrowhead military base from the Stephen King novel The Mist, which has often been cited by Gabe Newell and others as an inspiration for the atmosphere and setting of the game. Eventually, the name Half-Life was chosen because it evoked a theme of a research facility, and had a corresponding symbol in the lambda, which is the constant of decay in a, well, half-life equation in physics. One of the problems that Valve faced very early on was finding a publisher for the game. Most believed that what they were proposing was far too ambitious for a first-time developer, and perhaps even impossible for an experienced one. Luckily, Sierra Online was willing to do a one-game deal with Valve as they had interest in publishing a 3D action game based on the Quake engine. The deal saw Sierra give Valve about $1 million in exchange for 30% of the revenue and 100% of the intellectual property rights for Half-Life. Although this deal would end up causing tons of issues for Valve in the future, in the short term it provided them the cash they needed to fund Half-Life's development and to keep the company running until they could start selling games at retail. The team aimed for a November 1997 release date in order to compete with the upcoming Quake 2. And while development was coming along nicely as far as actual content and features getting made, there was a major issue. The game was simply not fun. Valve had built some interesting tech and some cool set pieces, but there was not really a good overall plan for the game, and playtesters had lukewarm reactions to it in the state that it was. The dev team knew that Sierra would not continue paying them for another year of development, but decided to trudge on anyway with the belief that they could make a better product in the long run by delaying it. Around the time of this delay, Valve was shipping alpha copies to press outlets to inform them about the technology being used in the game, and to show off some of the parts that had already been built. In 2013, one of these discs surfaced, with a disc image being published on Reddit and the physical disc itself selling on eBay for over $700. And there's a lot to learn about this version of Half-Life from the files present on the disc. The main portion of the alpha is a sort of playable museum that loads up if you run the Half-Life GL.bat file. This was the demo that was shown at E3 in 1997 that was well received by the general public. Walking through it shows off a number of new technologies that the game was pioneering, many of which I will talk about later when discussing the game itself. Something interesting here is that one of the named doors here is showing off flocking, which as far as I can tell is something that was cut from the final game except for a small sequence at the end. You also get the opportunity to fight a few grunts and other critters, as well as exploring some set pieces that were used in the final game. But there doesn't appear to be much else to this museum other than a few tiny tech demos. You can, however, see much more of what the game was like at this point in time by opening the console and using the map command to load in specific maps and play through them. The alpha disc has a helpful walkthrough giving the map IDs of each of these maps and explanations of how to explore them. The game maps are far from complete, but show a lot of the features that would become part of the final game. A lot of the level geometry is recognizable from locations in the game, including the office complex and later sections of the facility. One notable difference, however, is in the designs of most characters and enemies. For example, the headcrabs are a lot taller, redder, and have a weirdly large rear.
Boy, he's thick!
Also, there's a notable absence of zombies, especially in the early levels, meaning all you really get to fight here are headcrabs and the occasional soldier, until you get to the levels with some of the aliens. As far as how this version played, it's pretty incomplete, so it's hard to get to know. There are only 3 weapons included: a pistol, a submachine gun, and the crowbar. The crowbar can damage enemies, but it's unable to break boxes, vents, or glass. However, the walkthrough indicates that they plan to have it do that eventually. And the pistol fires incredibly slowly, making it not very viable against soldiers who have an unreasonably fast rate of fire. So I stuck to the submachine gun, and since the ability to launch grenades was already there and they're infinite, it was usually the best way to deal with enemies. The puzzles here are incredibly obtuse, especially in the first map, and the guide even recommends typing in console commands and enabling no-clip at several points, so it's clear that this was nowhere near finished. The game is also pretty likely to crash, at least when run through nGlide on a modern Windows system, so I had to restart a few times when the alpha decided it was done for the moment. Despite the trailer included on the disc stating a launch date of November 1997, this build from September of 97, while fascinating, was nowhere near ready to go, and it was the right call to delay it, as it likely would have been a pretty forgettable game. One interesting part of the contents of this alpha disk is the plot synopsis. Despite being vastly different from the final plot, it's an interesting look at how much Valve had plotted out for the game by September of '97. Quote, "The portal device is a dimension-spanning gate of unpredictable power, constructed in a decommissioned missile silo. So far, no one has ventured through the portal, but there's been a steady flow of odd creatures coming to our world. You are a weapons research scientist who has never touched a weapon. Until now. An accident in the Threshold's power core fractures the local fabric of space-time, and hordes of creatures begin spewing into our world through the fissures. Monsters are everywhere, and your coworkers are dropping like flies. You head for the surface, but the usual routes are unpassable, damaged by the disaster and infested with monsters. The silo security guards are in a state of primal terror and looking for someone to blame. The obvious scapegoats are the scientists, namely you. In your flight to the surface, you acquire a device which means the difference between victory and annihilation. But you don't realize whose victory until too late. As the portal experiment's first human subject, you are cast into the alien world to confront the ultimate horror, to cut off the invasion at its source. In Half-Life, you won't just go head-to-head with an alien boss, you will fight it from the inside out." Close quote. The plot treatment here is extremely different from what would be the final game, but has bits and pieces of what would become the plot of Half-Life. It's a very interesting insight into how far Valve had gotten with the game as of September of '97, and really how much was going to change between then and the launch. Once Valve realized the game was not coming together as they hoped, they decided that they needed to get everyone together and review all of the content that had been produced for the game thus far. Since a lot of the team were former modders, they had just kind of been creating cool stuff on their own, but never really made a plan on how to get it into a full game. So Gabe Newell piled all of Valve into one room and for 2 days played everyone's levels. And although his immediate reaction was panic at how they had basically nothing good, the result was that a cabal was formed to help guide the project forward into 1998.
Cabal was a small group of people, multidisciplinary group. There's like an artists, level designers, engineers, and everything in that. A small team that would write up a spec for a level. There was the arc that Mark had written, so we knew how that fit into the story.
And we got a small group of people together, and we started with the beginning, and we went through literally what map do we need to build to tell us the story we're going to have to tell, and then what does that connect to, and what's the next piece and the next piece.
The strongest and most influential thing that came out of them was, to me, the sketches. And they were really the visual meeting notes, right?
We came up with a formula for how that worked. We had a certain percentage of the time where you were fighting, a certain percentage of the time where you're exploring, a certain percentage of the time where you're solving puzzles. And so we could apply that uniformly through the game, and that worked pretty well.
With this new cabal and a unified vision in place, the Half-Life team was able to go from just making mishmash content to producing an actual game that customers would be interested in playing from start to finish. In this second year, they made a key change in how the enemy AI would be developed, with the focus on building the AI first and then building levels to match that behavior, instead of building a level and trying to figure out how to make working enemy behavior fit in that space. Several sections were specifically thought up to showcase a fun piece of AI that developer Steve Bond had built. A lot of these levels and areas were built in a week or less, but because the team had an idea of how everything would flow together, it helped to make it feel like a believable world and progression from one area to the other. Texture designer Karen Lahr wanted to enforce a sort of progression of what type of objects and materials would be available as the game went on as well. So in order to prevent designers from stealing textures that were meant for much later on in the game, she had to start naming all of the textures by the level they were intended for. This decision helped to solidify each level as distinct and keep things from becoming either stale or overused. As the game came close to completion, the team really started to crunch super hard. Several team members said they worked 18-hour days, and even those who had families already were affected. Harry Teasley said the whole second year was a crunch, and due to his wife having just delivered their first child, it was especially hard on him. Getting the ending section out was particularly difficult, as the team had procrastinated on it due to the tools not being well suited for an alien world and wanting to polish up the beginning. As a result, the ending was built in just a few weeks, and I'll talk about how those levels actually play later. But they did successfully get Half-Life out of the door on November 19th, 1998. Almost immediately upon release, Half-Life became a smash hit. According to Gabe Newell, the game was budgeted with the expectation of selling about 180,000 copies. However, by the end of the year, which was only a month and a half from release, Half-Life had sold 200,000 copies, and by May of 1999, it had sold about 1 million. Despite the big delay and setback, Half-Life was a successful first product for Valve, and launched the company into the 21st century with tons of momentum. The game also saw immense critical praise. The Metacritic aggregate score puts the game at a 96 out of 100, with many outlets giving it perfect scores. Jeff Green of Computer Gaming World said that it was, quote, not just one of the best games of the year, it's one of the best games of any year. An instant classic that is miles better than any of its immediate competition, and in its single-player form is the best shooter since the original Doom, close quote. Since release, it has continued to amass praise and awards, winning several Game of the Year awards and consistently being named as one of the best PC games of all time. Despite the praise, the game is now 26 years old. So how does it hold up today? Half-Life can be bought in stores mostly with one of two cover designs. The standard cover looks like this, and simply features a lambda on the cover with some interesting orange artwork. However, the cover folded out to reveal a blurb talking about features of the game including enemy AI, graphics, and the map editor included on disc. On the other side of this flap is a pretty cool piece of artwork depicting many of the enemies from the game alongside the protagonist, Gordon Freeman. The back cover continues this and talks more about technical features of the game. The later packaging this game was sold in was the Game of the Year edition. This edition has the same corroded orange look in the background, but with a picture of Gordon Freeman front and center and text indicating it as the Game of the Year. It also has a fold-out flap with a slightly different set of art, and the back cover which indicates that it also came with Team Fortress Classic. I, however, don't own either of these editions because they cost a lot and I'm poor, but I would like to one day. Both editions of the game came packaged with a manual, and while it mostly just has installation instructions and an overview of controls, there are some fun tidbits that make it worth reading. The manual opens with Gordon Freeman's employment offer letter, dated May 5th, 2000X. It mentions that Gordon is working at the University of Innsbruck in Austria at the time of his hire, and also that he's unmarried and has no known dependents. It also talks about how Gordon studied for his PhD under a Dr. Kleiner at MIT. And although a lot of these points do not really come up until the sequel, it is interesting to see how much of the lore was already built out in this manual. The manual also details weapons and enemies, as well as showing off concept art, which is pretty neat. Now, I don't think this manual is included as a PDF or anything on the modern Steam version, which is kind of a shame. But if you know where to look, you can find it online, and I thought some people would be interested to see what it contained. Of course, the most important component in the box was the game itself. Installing from the single CD is very straightforward, and it just takes a few minutes for it to finish, and it's good to go. Of course, the process on Steam is even more simple, and most people will play that way. Upon booting the original game, you get a Sierra Online logo, which has since been stripped from modern versions of the game due to a later lawsuit and Valve regaining the IP. And then we get to see the first iteration of the Valve guy. This one with a valve out of his eye, which is only slightly less creepy than the bald guy with it on his head. And then you're dropped onto the menu. For the Game of the Year edition, there are tons of options. These include starting a new game, running the hazard course, which serves as this game's tutorial, changing some options, and several multiplayer options. The multiplayer for this version of the game doesn't seem to work out of the box anymore, at least when I tested it, but the multiplayer is still perfectly functional for the modern Steam version. I won't be covering the multiplayer in this review, but I thought people would like to know that there's deathmatch multiplayer in this game and it's pretty good. There's also an interesting option to view game previews for upcoming Valve games, but all this does is open Valve's website in a browser. Curiously, their website still somewhat works on Windows 98, but of course no longer contains these previews. However, if we look at the Wayback Machine for around when the Game of the Year edition came out, we can find their product page and see that they were advertising for Half-Life, Team Fortress Classic, and even the original Team Fortress 2 that ended up being cancelled before release. The configuration options are pretty standard, mostly just letting you change video resolution and output modes, mess with volume, and rebind all of your controls. There is one interesting setting called Content Lock that allows you to disable multiplayer, blood, and jibbing of enemies for younger players. Although I don't know if all that actually makes the game appropriate for younger children. Almost all of these options have been carried over to the 25th Anniversary Edition, with some adjustments made here and there for modern hardware. You won't be seeing the ability to turn on EAX here, sorry. The hazard course is actually something I would recommend everyone play through before starting the game, even if you are familiar with first-person shooters. It's a fairly simple tutorial, but since the game itself doesn't really have a built-in one, there are a few mechanics it will clue you in on that may be a bit confusing. In fact, there is one mechanic I will talk about later that would basically be impossible to know how to use unless you had done the hazard course. You get a voice hologram assistant to walk you through it and even demonstrate some of the moves sometimes. The nice part about this tutorial being entirely separate from the main game is that on future playthroughs you don't have to sit through someone telling you how to shoot your gun again before getting to the fun part. Ocarina of Time's intro this is not. Also, side note, Ocarina of Time came out 2 days after this game did, so gamers in 1998 were having a good time. When you first start a new game, you get to choose from one of 3 difficulty settings: easy, normal, and hard. The differences between difficulty are simply how much damage enemies deal and how much health they have, as well as how much health and suit charge you get from drops and stations. There's one case where the mechanics change slightly on hard, but I will talk about that in mechanics. It does not appear that you deal any less damage to enemies, but it will certainly seem like it when enemies take more shots to kill. I played on normal for this review, so most of my thoughts and opinions will reflect how the game plays there. Upon starting the game, you are greeted with this intro.
Good morning, and welcome to the Black Mesa Transit System. This automated train is provided for the security and convenience of the Black Mesa Research Facility personnel. The time is 8:47 a.m. Current top.
One nice thing about the attention that Valve gave the game for the 25th anniversary was they pushed out a major update which included proper high-resolution widescreen support. So let's watch that instead.
At a pleasant 68 degrees at all times. This train is inbound from Level 3 dormitories to Sector C test labs and control facilities. If your intended destination is a high security area beyond Sector C, you will need to return to the Central Transit Hub in Area 9 and board a high security train. If you have not yet submitted your identity to the retinal clearance system, you must...
Now at first this tram ride may seem like it's a pre-rendered cutscene, as would have been typical at the time and even in most games today. But while watching, you may have either absent-mindedly moved the mouse or hit a key, which will reveal that the whole thing is played out live and you can move around the train. This is one of the key features that make Half-Life as a game and as a series unique. Control is almost never taken away from the player. At any point in the game, even when scripted sequences and story moments are going on, you can still move around a bit, move the camera, and more. And it really helps to dial up the immersion for me because you're actively participating at all times, and not just being shown a screen of exposition. Mark Laidlaw, head writer for most of the Half-Life games, said they did this partially because of time constraints, but also because they thought it was a way that games could tell stories very differently from any other medium. Whether it was primarily technical reasons or intentional choice, we'll never know, but the decision to leave the player in control at all times is a huge part of what gives Half-Life such lasting appeal. The tram ride serves not only as your way into work at Black Mesa, but for the player it helps tease how large this facility is and a number of the different environments that will be shown throughout the game. The announcer voice is mostly extra flavor, but it just helps to add to the sense that this is a real place where real people go to work. When you get to the end of the tram ride, you're let out by a security guard, and finally get to start meeting other characters and getting into the action. The thing is, however, there's no immediate action. On the surface, this is just a regular day at work. You see other scientists talking and working on computers, the guard at the front desk is dealing with a systems issue, and you can even take the opportunity to nuke someone's lunch.
My God, what are you doing?
This section of the game may seem boring, and you can basically skip past most of it, but it sets the stage for the things that are about to come. For one thing, you can interact with almost any object in the environment. That includes vending machines, laptops, buttons, and more. For another, it helps to ground the world before the disaster that's about to come. You get to see scientists and security guards all just going about their normal day of work, and even see them converse with one another at times.
Have you seen my coffee cup? Shut up.
How goes it?
What?
They're saying some cult murdered the Emperor and are opening the Oblivion Gates.
Now eventually you should stop wandering around and probably get to doing your job, so you have to find your hazard suit. As an anomalous materials scientist, you get to wear a really cool hazard suit in order to do your job, and in this game it also serves another function. Once you don your Hazardous Environment Suit, or HEV suit, you get your HUD, which shows your health, your shoot charge, your flashlight charge, and eventually your ammo and weapon. It also has this cool announcer voice that tells you your status from time to time.
Welcome to the HEV Mark IV Protective System for use in hazardous environment conditions.
You're able to recharge this suit at various HEV charging stations throughout the facility. And you can also replenish your health at similar stations, which are usually next to it or in the immediate vicinity. You can recover a smaller amount of suit charge from batteries that are scattered around the environment or dropped from crates, and similarly can recover from first aid kits that are found in the same way. The more charged your suit is, the less damage you take in combat and from environmental hazards, so you will want to try to keep it charged up as much as possible at all times. Upon donning the HEV suit, you can now head down to the test chamber, where the scientists are eagerly awaiting you to start a very important test. Essentially, a very large mineral sample of some kind was delivered to Black Mesa, and your job is to put it under a giant laser and see what happens. Oh, and also the administration wants you to push the laser beyond safe operating parameters. Nothing could possibly go wrong. Nothing at all. And the scientists definitely aren't acting ominous.
They're waiting for you, Gordon, in the test chamber.
Once you enter the chamber, you are instructed to flip on a switch to activate the anti-mass spectrometer, and then push the sample into it so that the testing can begin. If you wait around and don't push in the sample, the scientists get some concerned voice lines, but eventually they just loop what they say until you drop it in.
What is he doing in there? Nothing you need to worry about, Gordon. Go ahead.
Of course, the test goes horribly wrong, setting off what is later called a resonance cascade. Things start to go really haywire, and suddenly everything goes black. Once you wake back up in the test chamber, you see that everything's a mess, and things outside of it aren't much better. Scientists and security guards have been injured or killed, and the whole facility seems to be now falling apart due to what happened within that test. The once sterile functional research facility has been turned into a nightmare, and not just because it's falling apart. Creatures also seem to have poured through into the facility, not unlike the ones you saw during the resonance cascade. The scientists ask you to get to the surface and signal for help. And with your trusty crowbar at your side, you set off. One lesson that's taught very early on in Half-Life is that not all enemies need to be fought and killed. Before you can even collect the crowbar, there are several headcrabs placed in your way, so you are forced to dodge their attacks and run past until you can locate a weapon. In fact, a lot of your tools may not be directly killing an enemy, but using an ally to take care of them for you. One of the things that makes Half-Life really unique is the characters that accompany you from time to time during your adventure through Black Mesa. The one, or ones probably, who will accompany you most are the security guards, Barney.
Catch or buy a beer.
Technically, there definitely has to be more than one due to where you find them, and the fact that you probably get them killed at least once. Whether it was named after Barney Fife or Barney Miller, I'm not totally sure. But even when he was an MP in the beta, this character was known as Barney. And he's probably your most competent ally throughout. Even though he's only ever armed with his 9mm pistol, he is more than capable of taking out headcrabs, zombies, and tougher foes alike.
That'll look nice in my trophy room.
Even if he isn't capable of taking something down, he will gladly shoot at it until you either kill it or he perishes, which makes him an invaluable character to take with you at any point. He was so popular with players at the time that he eventually got his own spin-off, telling his story from his perspective of the Black Mesa incident, which I plan to review at a later date. Barney, as well as any of the science team members, can be told to follow you or wait behind by simply going up to them and hitting the E key. For Barney, this is useful because he will help you in combat, but you also need the scientists to follow you so they can activate retinal scanners to open doors for you. So somehow Gordon Freeman has worked at Black Mesa long enough for most of the security guards and scientists to recognize him and seem to have a relationship with him, but he hasn't gotten into the security system yet. Seems really inefficient, but this is a government research facility, so that probably tracks. Anyway, having each of these characters follow you around and talk to you from time to time helps the environment feel much less lonely and depressive. I also found myself caring about these characters a bit. and even reverted saves a few times in order to prevent their accidental demise if at all possible. All of them can be killed by you as well. There is friendly fire always on, but I never saw any reason to actually do so. One of the technologies that was the most innovative for Half-Life was the scripted sequences. Because of the new skeletal animation system, sequences from small moments to more complicated set pieces could be created to help flavor up the world. Instead of a fairly static world with some minor set dressing, Black Mesa feels like it is constantly changing and falling further into disrepair. These little sequences could be as small as a guard getting dragged into a vent, or as complicated as this.
No! Get it off me! Get it off! Get it off!
These scenes become even more impactful when they show off a mechanic or tie right into your next obstacle. They serve to show off little pieces of the game without requiring an exposition dump of some kind. One of the most foundational pieces in all storytelling advice is show, don't tell. And this system helped Valve to advance first-person shooters into a genre that was capable of showing a player what was going on, rather than just telling them through dialogue or a wall of text. These scenes are not always just showing, however. Sometimes they are accompanied by dialogue. Several times throughout, a character will tell you something you need to do, go and open a door, and then give you some more advice. It really has the effect of making scenes with other characters feel like a movie you can move around in and interact with. Whereas most games even today would make this a cutscene where everything is locked down and you have to just sit there and watch. Half-Life and its sequels still feel really unique to me in this regard, and although I don't think it's the only way to tell a story in a video game, it's definitely a very effective one. One of the early big twists in the game is presented using one of these scripted sequences. At one point you come up a stairway and see a scientist and for the very first time a soldier. And of course the scientist's first reaction is relief over the military showing up to save everyone. But when the scientist runs over to the soldier shoots him in the back over and over, immediately setting up the military as antagonists for the rest of the game. It's short and pretty primitive by today's standards, but I appreciate the simplicity of just the 5-second sequence to set up the military as the bad guys instead of some drawn-out cutscene. For me at least, it helped to set up what the next portion of the game would look like and immediately puts you in danger as a member of the science team. It turns out they were brought in to cover up the incident by wiping everyone out, and it's a pretty good plot device as it gives you another group of enemies to fight as you try to figure out how to fix the mess that you got Black Mesa into. Like any good game, Half-Life designed its levels so that there are often obstacles placed in the player's way that require them to solve problems to get around them. Where Half-Life differs from me is that it does its best to make these puzzles and obstacles feel like a natural part of a real location, and not just a maze designed by someone at a computer. These obstacles can be as simple as a pile of rubble, a locked door, a light that is causing electricity to run through the water, or a giant monster that can't just be shot to bits. And in almost every case, Valve found creative ways to make these solutions seem like an obvious or real-world solution, and at the same time make them satisfying to solve. My favorite example of this level design is in the chapter Power Up. Here, a giant alien called a Gargantua is blocking your path, and even very powerful weapons won't scratch it. And to add to the problems that you're facing, the power's out, meaning the train that could take you where you need to get is also off. So in order to get there, you have to trek down to the generator, past tons of soldiers, and turn on 2 generator pumps. One of these rooms is flooded and the pump is jammed, which requires you to go in and break some boxes which are jamming it up. After doing this, the room will drain and you can turn the power back on and head back to the tram. Unfortunately, the Gargantua is still there blocking your path, but fortunately turning on the power unlocks the key to destroying it. If you lure it down this tunnel, you will find these comically large Tesla coil looking things. And after flipping a switch while the monster is in there, it will get zapped with millions of volts of electricity, killing it and opening your path deeper into the facility. Not all the puzzles are this involved, but I found myself sufficiently challenged by them while also not having them be too frustrating. The telegraphing is often excellent in showing you what your objective is. Like this crane blocking your way in the chapter On a Rail, which has the switch right above placed in a booth, leaving you to just figure out how to get in that booth. From minor navigational hurdles to puzzles that span whole chapters of the game, Half-Life always finds new and interesting ways of making you think about how you need to proceed. The nice part is too that progression from one level to another isn't gated by a loading screen. There are technically quick loads between different maps, but they are engineered in a way to feel as seamless as possible. The Half-Life developers said they abused the save load system of the original Quake engine, which allowed them to be able to unload one level and load in the other, while maintaining some of the same geometry, making it seem like one seamless map. And overall this was a successful approach. Barring a few exceptions in the game, You are almost always continually progressing from one area to the next instead of hitting a switch, seeing a loading screen, and being teleported to a new area. Sometimes they disguise this by using elevators or airlocks, but a lot of times it's just a hallway from one area of the facility to another. This level design for Half-Life makes the entire Black Mesa facility feel like one place, and helps to make Gordon's adventures feel seamless and immersive, instead of just scenes from a bunch of different action movies. Although your initial goal was simply to get to the surface and get help for those trapped in the facility, the continual influx of monsters and the military turning on the science team makes things significantly more complicated for poor Gordon Freeman. Your goal quickly shifts to survival as well as finding some way to end this disaster. A guard tells you that you need to get over to the rocket launch complex and attempt to launch a satellite in orbit in hopes of shutting down the portal that is enabling these monsters to flood into Black Mesa. So despite just being a theoretical physicist, you have to kill trained soldiers and alien mutants alike in order to get there. And of course this is a first-person shooter, so how does the shooting play? This game takes a very different approach to first-person shooter combat than many of the titles that were popular at the time. On the back of the box is pasted a tagline that perfectly summarizes how Valve designed combat in this game. Run, think, shoot, live. Leadhead already did an excellent video on the combat in this game titled Why Half-Life is So Unforgiving. So if you want a bit of a deeper dive into it, I'll link it below. But I do have some thoughts of my own. Many shooters tend to have you as an action hero type figure who can't die. Someone who can just Rambo their way into an impossible situation and come out on top. However, this game intentionally makes you more of a John McClane figure, at least in the first Die Hard. Someone who is capable in combat but still has to be very tactical and pick their fights to make sure they stay alive. Even more so for Gordon Freeman, as he's an MIT-educated scientist who probably just picked up a gun for the first time at the hazard course earlier that day, and not a New York City cop. One of the things you'll notice very early on is that you cannot simply dodge some enemies' attacks. The one creature that loves to teach you this is the Vortigaunts. These guys first show up in the office complex section of the game, and their favorite method of attack is this laser beam that regardless of how fast it seems you move, you simply won't be able to dodge. Instead, you need to use cover and pick your shots carefully in order to avoid taking tons of damage, especially when there are 3 or more of them in an area pelting you with attacks. This is the first time you really get taught that you have to think more about combat in this game, as just trying to tank them with the shotgun will make you feel less like Doomguy and more like Lester the Unlikely. The arsenal you were given is incredibly varied too, and each of the weapons feels a unique niche. You have your staples in the crowbar, the pistol, the submachine gun, and the shotgun, but also crazier alien weapons like the hive hand, the glue-on gun, and the snarks. Learning how each of these weapons functions is incredibly important for staying alive, especially on hard difficulty. When you get to the sections that require you to fight off tons of human soldiers, you will especially need to be careful how you pick your fights, as their AI is much more complicated and punishing than something like a Vortigaunt. If you sit behind cover for too long, they will start to lob grenades at you to try to flush you out. And if they take lots of damage from you, they may retreat to a safe area, forcing you to come out into the open and face them, and potentially their backups. You'll find yourself entering an area cautiously, making a plan on how to take all the enemies out, and then seeing it fall apart when a soldier flanks you or launches a grenade at you, forcing you to improvise and fall back on something else. The fights in this game can be described as careful planning followed by chaotic improvisation, especially when a Vortigaunt decides to surprise you by teleporting in behind you when you advance to take out something else. One massive mistake that I made the first time I tried to play this game was relying on the SMG and shotgun almost exclusively to tackle enemies, and that tactic simply didn't work anymore when you get to one of the most well-designed chapters in the game, Surface Tension. Surface Tension takes all the tools you've been given so far and combines it with massive action set pieces in order to challenge you to use every last bit in your arsenal. This chapter is the largest uninterrupted section of action that takes place above ground in the game, and it has so many cool moments from the hydroelectric dam to the cliffside fights and onto the helicopter battle. These set pieces just punctuate a chapter filled with small moments that feel straight out of an action movie, and probably makes Gordon look like a movie protagonist by the end. Outside of all the spectacle, you will want to survey every encounter before charging in and taking out soldiers. At this point, the AI of the soldiers really takes the forefront and the aliens take a back seat, and you'll have to open that arsenal up for some of the weapons that may be a bit more neglected. One of my favorite examples of this is the Snarks. Snarks are this weird little alien creature you can pick up in pods, and when released they will head towards the closest non-alien creature and do damage to them until they are killed. This can mean yourself if you're not careful, and they will explode eventually, so there is a trade-off in sending them into an environment. However, if used properly, these can help to flush out enemies for you to attack, or distract them while you pick off other soldiers around you. They can even clear a room if you use enough of them and you hide around the corner. Probably the most memorable moment of this whole chapter is the helicopter fight, and this encounter introduces you into one of the most powerful and also maybe one of the most confusing weapons in the game, the RPG. The RPG on its surface is your standard rocket launcher, but it actually has two modes of fire. One where the rocket goes exactly at what it was pointed at when fired, and another laser guided mode that will guide it towards wherever you point it. You can switch between modes by right clicking. However, to this game's detriment, it never really explains how this works, and it can be hard to know that it even exists. Knowing how to use it does make the helicopter battle much easier and even fun instead of frustrating because you're missing it all the time. Another encounter I really like is this one with the tank in the trenches. It seems really difficult to survive if you just pop your head up where the first pipe exits, and you can beat it this way. However, if you stay crouched and use a little bit of stealth, you can get behind the tank and take it out with explosives, the RPG, or the Tau cannon, and then deal with the rest of the soldiers in whatever way you see fit. One of my favorite ways to deal with the soldiers is to shoot at them back around a corner, place a trip mine, and see them run around it and cause their own demise. In fact, explosives are extremely useful in this game, and one of my favorites is the grenade launcher on the MP5. Even if it makes zero sense to have underslung grenade launchers on SMGs, it's super fun. The SMG grenade launcher acts almost as a get-out-of-jail-free card if your combat plans fall apart, as most enemies will die if they are directly hit by these grenades, and many will die if you even just landed in the vicinity. Like the grenade launcher, almost all of the guns in this game have a secondary fire mode that you can access by right-clicking. The shotguns is really powerful, if a bit nonsensical. Okay, extremely nonsensical. By right-clicking, you fire 2 rounds at once somehow, even though the SPAS that Gordon uses is not a double-barrel shotgun, but instead a pump action with the bottom tube being used as a magazine.
Clever girl.
But I digress. Learning how to use all these secondary moves is another key piece of the combat puzzle, and the shotgun right click really helps you to survive when your plan falls apart and you get backed into a corner. Each of the weapons has a fun bit of flavor too. If you just stand around for a while, or even if you move but don't shoot your guns for a while, there will always be an interesting idle animation. The one for the snarks is my favorite, as you kinda try to poke it and it shooes you away. All of the reload animations for every gun that uses it is excellent as well, and just helps to add a little bit of visual flavor to tell you what is going on at any given moment with your weapons. There also always seems to be the perfect amount of ammo available for every encounter in the game. There's never so much that you feel like you can just fire away with reckless abandon, but there's just enough you can get from busting open crates with your crowbar, killing enemies, and searching stashes, that if you use up all your SMG ammo, it won't be too long before you can max it out again. This is also useful because there are several places you may want to use your weapons for puzzle solving instead of combat. Whether that be clearing a minefield, flipping a lever, or simply breaking open glass, the combat and puzzle solving play right into one another using your arsenal. One of the most interesting and difficult to fight enemies in the game is the Black Ops. They have one of the most interesting and effective introductions in the game, even surpassing that of the original soldiers.
Freeman, right? I've got a message for you. Make sure you don't...
All you see at first is a guard go down, and there's no indication of what actually killed him besides a suppressed bullet noise. If you just wander carelessly into the room before you, you may die pretty quickly, but hopefully that guard getting killed just like that will help you be a bit more cautious. As you progress in, you may see a flash of black run before you and hear gunshots from the other side. These are the female Black Ops soldiers, and not only do they have ridiculously high movement speed, but they can jump and get around rooms in a way that makes you have to rethink the entire combat puzzle. The difficulty is ramped up even higher in hard mode, where they can cloak almost entirely, making them really hard to track down and kill. These enemies will require you to be more defensive and cautious than you have been at any point in the game thus far. However, if you're careful and use your explosives well, you should be able to take them down just like you would anything else. The section soon after the Black Ops are introduced is one of the few times that control is taken away from you. You walk into this room and all the lights go out and you hear a scuffle, which shortly leads to you being dragged away by 2 soldiers.
Alright, we got him.
Where are we taking this Freeman guy? Upside for questioning. What the hell for? We got him. Let's kill him now. And if they find the body? Body? What body?
And you wake up inside a trash compactor, with all of your weapons that you have accrued suddenly gone. And unfortunately, you don't have a C-3PO to help shut it down.
We've had some problems. Will you shut up and listen to me? Shut down all the garbage mashers on the detention level, will ya? Do you copy? Shut down all the garbage mashers on the detention level! Shut down all the garbage mashers on the detention level! No! Shut them all down! Hurry!
But there is a ladder that will allow you to climb out of here and start your trek to recover all of your weapons again. It's a pretty brief time of vulnerability, as you were able to get all of your weapons and some ammo back very quickly. However, this will cause you to change up your combat strategies for a little while, as you will have to go and reacquire all your weapons like you're back at the start of the game, but the enemies that you're facing now are much more difficult and cunning than they were when you first left the test chamber. One of the things that has helped Half-Life to age as well as it has is its down-to-earth art style juxtaposed with an alien invasion. Most of Black Mesa looks like a bog-standard government facility, with concrete walls and basic tile floors. There is a bit of sci-fi sprucing up, but overall it's a believable aesthetic. This is immediately juxtaposed, however, by the headcrabs, zombies, and various other aliens that are invading the facility. This basic environment is also broken up occasionally by absolutely massive spaces such as giant pools of radioactive waste, rocket silos, and gigantic fans that would make Willy Wonka jealous.
It's pulling me in! I can't stop! I can't stop! What do we do? Grab hold of something quick! There's nothing to grab onto! Help! We're gonna get killed!
There are also outdoor spaces in the New Mexico desert that make for great vistas if a bit dated. The skybox used in surface tension especially stands out to me, and really helps to sell how in the middle of nowhere you are at Black Mesa. The ending few levels have a unique aesthetic as well, but I won't spoil those quite yet. In my opinion, the game still looks good, but it has aged a bit. The character models and textures in 3D were just starting to get close to realism, but the polygon count and texture density are low enough that they still look like early 3D nowadays. And even in the early 2000s, they were starting to look dated to some with how fast graphical fidelity was improving. So the team at Gearbox Software, who was in charge of the Half-Life expansions and the ports to consoles, looked to improve them a bit. On June 12, 2001, Gearbox released the Half-Life High Definition Pack, alongside Half-Life Blue Shift, which updated some weapon, character, and enemy models. It was originally intended to be used in the cancelled port of Half-Life to the Dreamcast, and when that port was cancelled, the changes as well as Blue Shift itself were simply ported over to the PC to be released a bit later. And the changes were controversial to say the least. Many characters were updated to have a higher poly count, but in many cases the new models changed the look of characters entirely, with Barney being one of the most egregious examples of this, though he doesn't look particularly good in either version of Half-Life, to be honest. They look much more cartoony and don't really fit the realistic vibe of the rest of the art style at all. Although each of these scientist models is more detailed, I don't think they look like the originals, and I would have preferred if they just slightly tweaked them instead of completely overhauled them. The enemies are mostly a wash and not really noticeable, with some minor changes, but the largest change was to some of the weapon models. 2 guns in particular were heavily affected, those being the pistol and the submachine gun. The pistol is changed from something resembling a Glock 17 to a Beretta 92, which is more of a preference thing in my mind, but the firing and reloading animations don't look as nice and smooth to me, so my preference goes to the original. The much more egregious change is to the SMG, which has been changed from an H&K MP5 to an M4 or M16 style rifle. And while it makes more sense for American troops to be carrying M4s and for them to have grenade launchers on them, they still end up using the same 9mm ammo that shares a pool with a pistol, so it's a no-go for me as far as using it in the original Half-Life. I definitely understand if people want to use them, but personally I prefer the original models, and Valve seems to as well because as of the 25th anniversary update they are disabled by default. So take from that what you will. One of the aspects of the game that has aged extremely well in my opinion is the sound design. Basically everything you hear in the game was done by one person, Kelly Bailey. He was responsible for music, sound effects, monster sounds, and most importantly wrote code for the DSP reverb effects, and he killed it in each of these areas. One thing that the sound design does really well is telling you what enemies you're up to. Most enemies, and especially the human soldiers, will use audio callouts to tell you what their AI is doing, whether that be fleeing, throwing your grenade, or trying to flank you. That really helps you to get an idea of what's going on around you, even if you can't always see what's happening. The Vortigaunts will also give away their attacks with a specific noise they use when they're about to fire off their beam attack, which should give you just enough time to duck behind cover if they catch you off guard. One of my favorite stories is how the enemy effects were created for the headcrabs. Here's what Kelly had to say about those.
Headcrabs were rats. The little squeaky, yeah, that's a rat slowed way, way down and then reversed.
The weapon sound effects for me are all great as well. They all just sound so satisfying to use and are instantly recognizable as their own thing. As far as ambient noise goes, individual areas have specific reverb effects. These really help to sell whatever space you're in as being as small or as large as it appears on the surface, whether that be a vent, tile hallway, or a cavernous room with no visible bottom. Beyond ambient noise, the game also has an excellent soundtrack. A lot of the tracks are fast-paced, upbeat, and help to dial up the tension in moments when the action ramps up. There are also some moody tracks for slower, more careful gameplay moments. And while none of the tracks are particularly long or complicated, or necessarily even memorable, they all work really well and enhance the experience for me. While overall I found Half-Life to be a unique and engaging experience, it is not without its flaws. Although the level design is often not only excellent but some of the best in gaming, there are times where it's anywhere from bad to awful. One particular example that will always stand out to me is the conveyor belt section of the chapter Residue Processing. These conveyors all overlap, and finding the right path out is extremely tricky. And they even loop, but since there's so many conveyors in small tunnels, you may not even realize you've gone around in a circle until you've done so several times. The right way to go also includes a trip mine that's incredibly difficult to spot, and will probably kill you the first time, perhaps even dissuading you from thinking that that's the right path. Another oft-criticized part of the game is the chapter on a rail. Partially I think this is because it will also loop you around on the trains if you don't figure out how to switch tracks with your gun. But I never found the chapter to be as tedious as other people do, and in fact I found most of it enjoyable. The train sections, outside of on a rail, are pretty brief, but it does a good job of adding a vehicle into the game while also helping to show the scale of Black Mesa a little bit more. Another minor annoyance is that sometimes when you need an NPC to follow you to help complete a task, they seem to get stuck and you have to go back and click E on them a few times before they'll start following you again. It's nothing major, but it can get a bit annoying when you need them to follow you a long distance like I needed Barney to do in this section. And the last thing that's a much larger issue with the game is really the last several levels. If you don't want the ending spoiled for the game and a lot of the major story beats, you can go ahead and skip to the timestamp shown on screen where I will give my final thoughts. As you progress throughout the game, you start to see some things in spots they really shouldn't be. In particular, aliens in cages, test chambers, and tubes where they've clearly been since before the Residence Cascade. It starts to become obvious that this incident isn't the first exposure that Black Mesa has had to these critters, and when you finally arrive at the Lambda complex, your suspicions are confirmed. The scientist you find here tells you that they've been to the world that these creatures come from, and you must go in there yourself in order to close the portal that has been letting them through, as a powerful force of some kind seems to be keeping it open. And this is where the game starts to fall apart. The first issue here is you are introduced to a brand new mechanic right before entering the border world's end, long jumping. Now if you decided to do the hazard course before starting the game, it would explain it to you. But as I and probably 95% of people skipped it the first time they played the game, there is no explanation on how to do it. A simple on-screen pop-up with the controls would have been nice, as the combo is a pretty simple crouch, run, and jump, but introducing it right here with no real explanation is kind of a failure of designing this section in my opinion. Once you jump through the portal that the Lambda team opens for you, you are dropped into Zen. And while the aesthetic is super cool, the level design is all over the place. You immediately have to put the long jump module to use to crawl down a bunch of platforms. And while that part is fine, where you need to go next is extremely confusing. Once you've picked your way down to this large platform below, it just seems to end there. Whereas the rest of the game seems to always have somewhere you could at least try to go or some sort of visual clue as for where you need to be, there isn't really anything here. You just have to wander around until eventually you decide to look off the edge and see another platform slightly below, which can be actually a bit tricky to land on. Down here the level design improves a bit, with your first introduction to the healing pools and an interesting little puzzle. But as soon as it's begun, it's over, and you're on to the next chapter. Gonarch's Lair is an interesting, if somewhat disturbing, boss fight that has a bit of a tendency to glitch out at the end. But as long as you keep shooting at it and follow it when it runs off, you should be okay. And then you hit Interloper. The first few bits of Interloper are interesting outdoor bits, including the return of a Gargantua and the noise-sensing tentacles from earlier in the game. They are a bit confusing, especially the first island with the tunnel that's kind of hidden away in the corner, but it's nothing too horrible. The factory section, however, is probably the part most people associate with Zen, and for all the wrong reasons. This part of the game is supposed to show you that the Vortigaunts are actually not hostile, but being controlled by some larger force, as they will not attack you as long as you leave them alone. The problem, however, is that for the entire game up until this specific moment, and for the rest of the game after, they are happy to just fire on you at first sight. And there isn't really any sort of scripted sequence or moments that indicates to you that they're non-hostile. So most likely you will shoot the first one you see in the face with the shotgun, and not find out that they are passive, as the rest will just continue to attack you. The other major problem I have with Interloper is these gear elevators. There have been tons of other elevators in the game, and often there were important parts of combat that you could use to plan your attacks. But here they just spin around and around, totally messing up any shot you may want to take while on them. This also makes it very hard to hit enemies that may reside on them. So for me, they just seem to go very counter to the design philosophy of the rest of the game. There are also these floating alien baby things that now pelt you from all angles, and they are a bit of a pain to take down. Flying creatures and enemies are always hard to make fun to fight. And as supplies are decreased throughout all of Zen, they really just end up becoming a waste of your revolver ammo and a drain of your patience. The only thing that seems to draw out these chapters is tedium, as opposed to being packed with action, battles, and set pieces like the rest of the game. And once you memorize where to go, most of the first 3 chapters of Zen can be run through in about 20 minutes. I understand why these chapters feel slapped together. They were mostly done in the last few months of development, and the tools they had were really not well designed for the organic alien concepts they had for Zen. So, especially here in Interloper, it starts to feel like a worse reskin of the Black Mesa facilities with tight corridors and hallways. I just wish Valve had been able to take the time to flesh these levels out a bit more, as the concept is really cool to me. Around Zen, you do find the occasional HEV suit wearing inhabitant who appears to have keeled over, and this is where you will find supplies here. This does imply that you are not the first one there, and it seems unlikely that you'll return. But I guess Gordon has to try to make any sacrifice he can to stop the invasion of Earth from the other side. When you get to the end of Interloper and make it to this portal, you land on a barren island and hear voices. And as you approach a second island, these voices become louder. Upon entering the portal here, you are teleported instantly in front of a giant-headed, baby-looking alien. This is the Nihilanth. I think that's how you pronounce it. And it seems to be the creature that not only has been keeping the portal open to Earth to invade, but also enslaved the Vortigons to do its bidding. And as cool and weird as this visual is, the boss fight kinda sucks. The battle starts with you in this large arena, with 3 large crystals above him. Although it is never explicitly stated, the color and type of these crystals seems to match the sample that was delivered at the beginning of the game, which eventually started the resonance cascade. Perhaps they are linked in some way, but it's never really been explained. Nothing tells you this is what needs to be done, but if you use your rocket launcher, you can pretty quickly destroy these 3 crystals. It should then be a simple challenge of getting to the alien trampoline pads, avoiding the Nihilanth's attacks, and opening fire on his now exposed head. It's not as easy as I described it, however, as one of this giant baby's attacks causes you to be teleported into a different chamber, falling down to the bottom and having to traverse your way back up. The positive about this is that each of these rooms has a little bit of ammo and health supplies. However, I found it to be extremely obnoxious having to get back up to the top to teleport back, especially in this room where very precise platforming up narrow ledges is required to get there, and it basically necessitates save scumming. I just had to resort to hiding behind pillars whenever he carried out an attack and hope that the orbs hit in instead of me. Because even when you are mid-air trying to kill it, this attack can track you and send you on several minute-long side tangents, totally killing the base of the boss fight. And man, these teleports feel like they're happening every other minute, and if you don't save and hide behind the pillars, it's just going to be dragged out way longer than it really should be. Upon flying up and killing the Nihilanth with everything and anything from your arsenal, he explodes into a shower of lights and colors, and you're teleported in front of a man you may have noticed before. Lingering, watching, always just out of reach. Here's what he has to say to you.
Gordon Freeman in the flesh, or rather in the hazard suit. I took the liberty of relieving you of your weapons. Most of them were government property. As for the suit, I think you've earned it. The border world, Zen, is in our control for the time being, thanks to you. Quite a nasty piece of work you managed over there. I am impressed. That's why I'm here, Mr. Freeman. I have recommended your services to my employers, and they have authorized me to offer you a job. They agree with me that you have limitless potential. You've proved yourself a decisive man, so I don't expect you'll have any trouble deciding what to do. If you're interested, just step into the portal, and I will take that as a yes. Otherwise, well, I can offer you a battle you have no chance of winning. Rather an anticlimax after what you've just survived.
And it ends where it all started, on a train car. As the G-Man tells you, you do have a choice. If you decide not to accept his offer of employment, he drops you in front of a ton of alien grunts and other nasties with no weapons or anything. And presumably you perish as the screen fades to black for the bad ending. However, if you jump into the portal, he congratulates you for your choice.
Wisely done, Mr. Freeman. I will see you up ahead.
And that's it for Half-Life. The ending probably leaves as many questions as answers for us. Who is this mysterious G-Man? Who are his employers? And what happened to everyone else back at Black Mesa? Some of these questions will be answered in the sequels, but many still have not been, and more questions will be posed. And at the end of the day, that mystery is part of what keeps bringing players back to this game and the series as a whole. I've played through Half-Life 2 many times, but until a few months ago I'd never gotten further than a few chapters into the original game. And I'm so glad that I decided to play it all the way through. Despite it on the surface looking dated, I found a deep, creative, unique, and groundbreaking game that totally redefined what first-person shooters could be, and in many ways still has not been matched. If any of it seems cliched or standard, it really is only because of the norms and patterns that it established, as it easily set the bar for FPS games for half a decade, at least until the sequel was released. Overall, I think Half-Life is a worthwhile play for anyone, even those not normally interested in first-person shooters, and well worthy of the many accolades and awards it has received over the years. Thank you so much to everyone who's watched this review and who continues to support my channel. If you like this one, make sure to like, subscribe, and leave a comment of your thoughts, especially if you want to remind me about something I missed or tell me what you think about Half-Life. I have a bunch more content coming, and if you love retro gaming, I hope you'll join me next time. But most of all, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.